Hi, all. I'm broadcasting from the studio of Ed Keenan. He has graciously agreed to help me out in producing these online lectures.
Hi, everybody.
So, I want to talk about Kantian ethics and begin a discussion of Kant's conception of the good will. This is going to play into Kant's theory of value. So, recall in virtue ethics, the question of what is the good is answered by good character. In utilitarianism, it's good consequences producing the greatest amount of well-being. Those both have certain relations to like action. Character is somewhat prior. The consequences are after it. What Kant is going to propose is an examination of what he calls the good will. And this has to do with the way in which one deliberates and acts on principles. So it's prior to action, and he thinks from the standpoint of pure and practical reason, it will be possible to determine whether a particular principle is permissible to act upon, whether it is good or praiseworthy or blameworthy. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the themes we'll see in Kant's ethics, some of the ways in which the Kantian theory can be expressed, and then we'll begin to dive into the kind of foundation of that, Kant's project, and how he kind of thinks about the place of moral thinking within the context of human knowledge sort of more broadly, and his argument that we should think of it as a kind of a priori science, one that is discoverable through the use of reason and in a way that is entirely sort of separate and prior to a particular experience. He thinks that we can evaluate various principles and then determine the permissibility or the value of those things on the basis of a kind of rational examination of them. And so we'll talk about what this conception of the goodwill is, the way that this will kind of differ from a utilitarian ethics. And before we dive fully into that, I want to take a moment to look back at one of the issues we saw in both Varoufakis and Amartya Sen's work. Recall the discussion in Varoufakis of the development of new technologies and new ways of organizing life, and the way that that often brought together a great variety of various chemicals, the way those, and bacteria, and other sorts of products of like human and animal life, the role those have in developing viruses and bacteria that pose risks to human life. And recently, in connection with the coronavirus, or in connection with Amartya Sen's work, there's the question of how we should conceive of economic rationality, what it makes sense for a business to pursue given these sort of laws of the market, and how that may coincide or diverge from what we might call moral sense. So recently, the Trump administration attempted to acquire the research, labor, and work of a German pharmaceutical company, and to acquire exclusive rights to the product of its research and development. A virus for this vaccine would be world-shaping in its implications. And the United States, through the Trump administration, sought to acquire exclusive rights such that, say, only Americans could have access to it. This brings up the question of distribution, and that only Americans should receive it is perhaps one principle. That principle might be even more narrow in terms of its actual application. Maybe only those who have a sufficient amount of material wealth can buy it. Say, the testing for the virus up to this point has costed somewhere around $1,300 to $1,600 per test for people with insurance that was mitigated in large part, so they only had to pay somewhere between $100 and $500. For people without, they had to pay generally around $1,600. And given the sort of vastness of these social systems and the particular response taken here, it's worth questioning both what seems an apt and just response. As we get into Kant, it's worth thinking about what kind of response could be justified by a sort of moral principle that could be universalized, or what could be in accordance with the moral law. What is it that we ought to do on the basis of consideration of such a thing? Yes. So, the White House made this bid, and as you saw on the previous slides, the German government has mobilized its efforts to prevent the purchase of that. It's worth kind of thinking about, given the sort of various theories we've looked at, perhaps Hobbes will give a different answer than what Amartya Sen suggests might be most plausible. It's worth thinking about how those answers come apart and why they do. Okay, turning now to Immanuel Kant and a kind of survey of the basic parameters of his theory, some of the motivations for that, etc. Kant was born in 1724 in the town of Königsberg, which is modern-day Russia. At the time, it was sort of part of the proto-state of Germany. He lived there for the vast majority of his life. He spent several decades of his life concerned with various kind of foundational questions in philosophy, questions about the scope and limitations of our knowledge, how it is we should think about our relation to the world, the certainty we can derive from experience or the lack thereof, and an attempt to sort of bridge some of the conflicts between prior empiricists and rationalists. He wrote the Critique of Pure Reason concerned with these questions. It's widely regarded as one of the most sort of significant and widely read texts in contemporary analytic philosophy. He's also a rationalist, as was Plato, as was Bentham, but of a very different sort than Bentham. And he falls under the kind of meta-ethical category of a moral realist. In other words, he believes that there is some existing subject matter that our moral claims in some way describe. So he thinks there is something like a moral law, and from considerations about our basic concepts, those of duty and obligation, we can come to begin to understand some of the basic contours of that. With a more critical analysis, we can begin to derive fundamental laws and requirements that are binding on all rational beings. So Kant is a deontologist. Deontology is the study or the kind of logic concerning, or the study of the logic concerning obligation, what implications follow from obligations, how we should think about obligations and how they relate to one another, whether some obligations have something like a higher priority or a more foundational significance than others. Deontological theories contrast with with consequentialist ones, which analyze the goodness of an action in terms of its consequences. Deontological theories evaluate the merits of an action on the basis of whether it passes certain requirements or tests that don't have to do anything necessarily with their consequences. So contemporary forms of Kantian ethics have looked into a wider array of practical domains. Christine Korsgaard is a particularly famous contemporary Kantian. She works at Harvard. She's done a lot of work on the way that we might think about some of the further implications or ways of developing Kantian theory and metaethics. So, in line with some of her work, you might think of somebody who is a soccer player, say. They, in virtue of that, have some general obligations to practice in order to maintain their proficiency at the sport, particularly if they're engaged in a tournament or in some other prolonged activity. There are perhaps circumstances under which those obligations might be cast off. Say somebody chooses or decides, I no longer want to play soccer. We might think of those duties as contingent then. In other words, they are duties that apply under some conditions or sometimes. We'll see in Kant that it's posited there are also sort of necessary obligations or obligations that apply at all times. He thinks one such obligation you have is to respect the humanity or dignity of all persons. It's perhaps worth noting in the kind of biographical details about Kant that he was unfortunately also involved in the early development of race theories, and that he played a fairly pernicious role in some of that. So there are certainly aspects of his theories where some of this perhaps seeps through, and it's worth noting as well that Kant's experience of the world was in many ways quite limited. So these are things to take into consideration. They may undermine or may not undermine certain aspects of his theories. It's worth considering sort of in context how different formulations of the Kantian theory might be susceptible to concerns about say, a lack of consideration about power dynamics. Kant thinks that circumstances or context shouldn't substantially change or undermine whether a principle is permissible or not. And so, say one lacks relative power and finds himself sort of socially pressured or coerced to act in some way, Kant is going to sort of fail to take into consideration the power dynamics is something that directly affect the permissibility of different ranges of actions. And we'll see later when we begin to look at the theory of Marx, how like those sort of critiques are like made more systematic, but seem to take some considerations perhaps from the Kantian theory. So the contrast between a deontological system and a consequentialist system. A consequentialist system says that we can evaluate the goodness of an action on the basis of the consequences that follow from it. Those consequences are measured according to the particular theory of value that the consequentialist adopts. The utilitarian says that's well-being, but there are other ways of formulating consequentialist theories. You could have, for instance, and it's worth considering the kind of relation this might have to a Kantian theory that's focused on like matters of promise keeping. So the Kantian is going to think it's always the case that you ought to keep your promises. You could imagine a consequentialist theory that measures value in terms of something like promises kept. There will be kind of interesting differences between the outputs of the consequentialist theory and the deontological theory. The deontological theory is going to create constraints on a domain of possible action. So the utilitarian theory selects one course of action that will produce the greatest net balance of good, and it says this is the correct or right action. The deontological theory says there are certain things that you must observe, that you should say you should keep your promises, that you should generally like seek to improve your faculties or your capabilities. You should seek to improve yourself as like a person, and you should like take in various sort of things which will like improve your sort of like cognitive or rational life. Those we'll talk about later as imperfect duties. Those can be satisfied at multiple different times in multiple different ways, and so don't require sort of constant observance, whereas these sort of necessary duties must always be observed. So it puts a constraint over a domain of possible action such that, say, if at various points you see, well, I could, say, choose not to tell the truth in this particular situation and perhaps like avoid some conflict. Say somebody asks whether you like the gift they gave you and you don't really, but you decide like for the sake of maintaining sort of agreeable relations, you say, yeah, I really like it. A Kantian is going to think that this sort of action is actually like bad and impermissible. A consequentialist might think like, or a utilitarian, for instance, might think like, all things considered, this is like not harmful and like it's perhaps even good.
To ask a quick question, I would almost ask like the idea of duty. It seems really, you mentioned how it comes from identity. It seems kind of mixed in, and it seems to me like there needs to be like a delineation almost between like how much of duty comes from your internal self and how much is imposed on you by society. Some might argue that you have a duty to keep your friend happy and lie about the gift in that sense, and that duty is, I mean, and I think you can kind of talk about how they sort of have like a relationship that's almost that can be you can construct a duty around an end almost, and sorry, go ahead.
Good. So this is like ultimately a question about what we might call the source of duty. Like, is it the case that duties arise because, say, I'm related to other people in a community and the community operates in a certain way. And so just contingently then, because of that, it's the case that I ought to do certain things. Say that I ought to like get up at 6 a.m. and like participate in the moving of like some supplies to like a general area. Or as Kant thinks it is, Is it the case that duty comes from the fact that I'm a rational being and there are certain laws that constrain rationality, that certain kinds of things are unworthy of the sort of like action of rational beings? Kant thinks there's something external to me. There's this moral law, and it's discoverable through reason, and it's not contingent. Whereas the particular way in which some community is organized is a kind of contingent matter. It could be otherwise. And if we look across like space and time, we find different ways of communities being organized. Kant thinks that independently of all that sort of contingency, there is something that is kind of universal and can be recognized by all creatures capable of reason. So some things that are particularly significant in the Kantian theory: Kant thinks that matters of personal autonomy, that, say, I am able to make an informed decision about what it is that I do. In other words, others owe it to me that they not deceive me, or they not tell me something that would lead me to act contrary to the way in which I would if I were relevantly informed. This is something that like we don't see quite as much in utilitarianism. Recall the kind of problem that, say, if a judge is presented with a person they believe on the basis of the evidence presented ultimately to be innocent, but there is a mob pressing for the punishment of that person, and in the absence of them being punished, they will riot and many more people will be hurt. The utilitarian may say, in this case, like, you ought to at least like carry out the appearance of punishment, and perhaps you should actually follow through with that, depending on the consequences, or depending on the sort of relative consequences of like each of those different courses of action. The Kantian is going to think, no, that would involve like lying and deceiving people, and that's not worthy of the dignity of rational creatures. So it would be impermissible for the judge to deliver a verdict of guilty when they're actually innocent. And this is connected to the Kantian concern with persons as ends in themselves. Kant borrows or sort of like brings back some of the language of Aristotle, this sort of teleological theory of ends. And Kant endorses that. He thinks, well, we are creatures that can create ends, and we also can be governed by certain constraints on those ends. And it is our humanity, our sort of rational capacity to deliberate, to legislate under some of what we'll see are the formulations of the categorical imperative, to make decisions about what principles one will be animated by or governed by. And as noted, this is a theory that looks centrally at the nature of duty. And so the consequences are not going to be things of first order moral importance. They factor in, when they do, only at kind of later stages, when they have implications for moral psychology more broadly. So Kant begins the Metaphysics of Morals with the observation that it seems that everything in nature operates according to laws. So we have the laws of nature, and we make attempts to discover their contours, as, say, Aristotle attempted to, and as arguably more successfully Newton later did, and subsequently Einstein. And there's a certain kind of puzzle that arises rather quickly, because, well, we seem to be a part of nature, but are we governed by entirely and exclusively all the same laws that, say, rocks and trees are? It seems like we have a kind of freedom that other existing things do not. And we then might aspire to discover something like the laws of freedom that govern the possible courses of action we could take. And we should discover also what rational constraints apply to us as rational beings, what it is that we must do. And so Kant thinks these kinds of constraints, because they apply generally and universally to all rational beings, these we can think of as a sort of grounding of warranted action. So Kant notes that if we return to the sort of categorical divisions of ancient Greek philosophy, that there's actually a systematic and underlying kind of principle division there. And he says we can discern between what we might call material knowledge, that is knowledge that concerns a particular subject matter and generally knowledge of the world. And there's also what he calls formal knowledge. And the sort of purest formal knowledge is simply the laws of logic. And these, he says, are demonstrable by proof. So you can show in classical logic, for instance, that you can't have any true contradictions, or rather from that kind of axiom, you can prove various other things, that every proposition is either true or false. And these are compatible with all sort of ways in which the world could be. There is then the attempt to understand the world more substantively, and that falls under the domain of this kind of material knowledge. And we can divide it further. There is, on the one hand, physics. This is the subject matter broadly of the natural sciences or natural philosophy. And there's the subject matter of ethics. And ethics is concerned with action. So there's the kind of formal principles that generate constraints over what could be, and given then sort of like the space of possibilities, there's questions about what is. And within ethics, there is the question of what ought to be. Okay, so under the domain of material knowledge, we find physics and ethics. Physics is concerned broadly with what is, what exists, and how objects in the material world relate to one another. We can then subdivide that broad sort of area of inquiry into the a priori and the a posteriori. The a priori is that which can be known prior to or without the use of experience, whereas a posteriori knowledge is that which one gains through experience. So, for instance, if I tell you that there is a table in the other room and that the surface of the table is a certain color, then what color exactly would be an object of a posteriori knowledge, whereas that, say, purple is a color, or that all bachelors are unmarried, or that if a particular proposition is true, then that proposition is true, or whether an argument is valid or not. These are objects of a priori knowledge, or these are things that can be known a priori. So the a priori component of this broad sort of study of natural philosophy or physics can be is concerned with what we might call metaphysics. It's about the foundation of this inquiry, about what the sort of general categories are, how things like time and space relate to one another, what the kind of general nature of objects and conditions of identity are. The a posteriori component of physics is the sort of concrete particular observations that we use in our theories, the particular kind of more concrete theorems concerning if we engage in some like experimental setup, what the outcome will be, and general sort of predictive claims about what type of events will transpire in the future. These all fall under the domain of the a posteriori. In ethics, then we also have a kind of a posteriori content, and there are two sort of dimensions to this. One concerns the a posteriori judgments of particular cultures, and this will be a kind of contingent matter. What within a particular culture is, say, judged as praise or blameworthy. We can find potentially a great variety in the nature of these judgments across different cultures. Within some cultures, say, the practice of like wearing masks in a pandemic may be more common than in some other. If one simply references the sort of practices of one's surrounding culture, these practices exist contingently, they could be otherwise, and Kant thinks these will lack a kind of sufficient moral force to warrant acting in some particular way. The fact that a particular culture praises this, that's not enough to think that this is a good act, or in the kind of converse situation, the fact that something is like blamed in a culture, that by itself is not enough. There has to be some grounding identifiable by reason in order for a moral judgment to be fully warranted on Kant's view. And so what he wants is to discern the nature of the sort of a priori subject matter concerned with ethics. There's one other component within the a posteriori, which is relevant to particular moral judgments and factors into the matter of warrant or merit. And that is what he will call these sort of laws of freedom, what it is that we could do. And Kant thinks that we have to sort of deliberate with the idea that we have freedom. And he thinks we have to thus act under sort of the idea of freedom, even if like it may in some cases seem dubitable whether like a person is free. He thinks this is the sort of condition of our being capable or being worthy of praise or blame, of the sort of basic conditions of responsibility. There has to be this sort of like informed, rational choice. This is what it is that binds us to morality, Kant thinks. So the distinction between formal and material philosophy, again, formal philosophy is logic, and it has no empirical content. Its laws are taken to be universal, necessary, and demonstrable by proof. We then take those sort of formal constraints and apply them to a particular subject matter, and we get the contents of material philosophy. That aspect which is concerned with the laws of nature, we call physics or natural philosophy, and that aspect which is concerned with what we might call the laws of freedom, what it is we could do, and judgments about what it is we ought to do. This is the subject matter of ethics or moral philosophy. So, and we've seen some of this already now, natural and moral philosophy both have empirical a posteriori components, and physics has to attend to actual material events and develop a theory of what kinds of events will happen. And moral philosophy has to attend to what we might call these laws of freedom, that which constrains the possibility of our choosing. And it can deal in a kind of secondary sense. And here, Kant thinks this is of less sort of practical significance to our first order considerations about what it is we ought to do. What he calls like practical or cultural anthropology, where we examine what kind of judgments people do have. He says the rational counterpart, this is morality proper, and the moral law must be entirely separate from anthropology. We are concerned with the empirical contents only insofar as they constrain possibilities. He thinks, as rational beings, we have a capacity to judge of what could be willed by all. So Kant is seeking what one might call a metaphysics of morals. He wants to understand what the sort of foundation in the world and in relation to individual practical reason is. And he thinks there has to be a kind of rational necessity associated with it. Anything other than that, he will claim, results in a kind of heteronomy of the will, in which one is driven by forces outside of themselves. What he wants in contrast is a kind of autonomy, one in which you confer on yourself the moral law. And he thinks it is only this latter kind that could gain a kind of rational, necessary, practical force. One will think, in virtue of the fact that this is a person, in virtue of the fact that they can reason, I owe them certain things. I owe them the basic information concerning what it would take for them to make an informed decision with regards to some course of action. So he thinks it can't stem merely from these kind of practical, contingent aspects of our Constitution. He thinks, look, the way that we are at, say, even a particular point in time, this can't be a sort of grounding basis for which we develop practices concerning what ought to be. The rational necessity must originate outside and prior to these considerations. He is in search of something that could govern across all time and space. So if we, say, came in contact with some highly intelligent alien life, then we could communicate with them and each be constrained by similar principles of morals. And we will see, he thinks, that in order for an action to be good, it's not enough for the action to be done merely in accordance with the moral law. There will be multiple actions that may meet such a description, say, of a person who is in sales. They may choose to be honest with their customers and charge them a fair amount, and they may do that simply because they think if they act otherwise, then the reputation will be harmed and they will suffer some financial punishment from their deceit in the future. They might follow that course of action, though, of being like honest to their customers because they believe that this is something that their customers are owed as rational persons. So it's this sort of latter kind that Kant is going to think has a kind of objective warrant. He says that when we begin to sort of examine our preconceptions or our common sense views about the nature of morality, he thinks we can begin to ask the sort of question of value. What is good, and what is good without qualification? And he says many of the things that are praised by, say, either virtue ethicists or by utilitarians, things like intelligence, wit, or judgment, in the case of virtue ethicists, and anything which will be conducive to generating good consequences, in the case of utilitarians, these things are really only good with a certain kind of qualification. Because, for instance, you could imagine that, say, a Nazi had the fortune of winning the lottery, and this event is very good for them. It improves their well-being. Kant says a rational spectator couldn't feel any kind of warrant in thinking that that event is good in a kind of simpliciter sense. It's perhaps good for the particular individual, but taken from a distant standpoint, this would be actually morally undesirable. And this kind of directly contradicts Hume's view, where we take an impartial standpoint. We imagine the effects of a particular policy, event, or action. And if those events produce like pleasure or pleasant experiences, then we're inclined to think that the actions are good or right. If they produce pain, then we're inclined to think that they're bad or wrong. And Kant is proposing a very different sort of criteria of judgment here. He is concerned with what he describes as identifying the conditions under which we could be worthy of happiness. So Kant is concerned with what we might take to be prior to these sort of objects of value that are the primary objects of consideration in other moral theories. Kant is concerned with what could be a merited principle, or what could have moral worth in its own right without qualification by a particular context. And Kant thinks that this kind of supreme value is to be located within the sort of domain of intention, of what it is that one deliberately chooses to pursue or bring about, and on the basis of the sort of principles on which they operate. So he notes that, well, somebody could act on the basis of an evil intention but bring about a good consequence. Utilitarians might be tempted in such a case to say, well, we should praise them, or we should take a kind of ameliorative approach and attempt to encourage them to continue producing such beneficial kinds of behavior. Whereas the Kantian might think, no, if they acted of an evil intent, then they're blameworthy and potentially worthy of retaliation if they were appropriately knowledgeable of what it was they did or what it is they willed. And likewise, he notes, somebody could act for a good reason or on the basis of a good principle and yet bring about bad consequences. Ultimately, the consequences are outside of our control. And so Kant thinks we could only be sort of directly responsible for that which is entirely within our control. And this is what we choose to do, what it is a sort of product of a rational deliberation. Kant thinks our freedom is something that arises from our rational capacities. So he thinks the supreme object of value is what he calls the good will. And he says, even if this should wholly lack power to accomplish its purpose, if with its greatest efforts it should not achieve anything, and there should only remain the good will, then like a jewel, it will still shine by its own light, as a thing which has its whole value in itself. Its usefulness or fruitfulness can neither add nor take away anything from its value. The consequences don't have any direct impact on the praise or blameworthiness of a particular action or on a particular deliberated principle that one acts on. Kant argues that if we think about the function or the purpose of reason, well, if we simply wanted to achieve a greater quantity of pleasure, well, we might be able to better achieve that without reason, simply by having a beneficially disposed set of instincts. And yet, he thinks, look, we are obviously creatures capable of reason, and reason seems to be attuned more to matters of truth and falsity. It is responsive to considerations about those things. And the reasonable person may be less happy than the ignorant. But he thinks it is obviously preferable to be a creature capable of reason rather than one purely sort of driven by instinct. He thinks that what makes humans distinct in the world is that they can be animated or constrained by a conception of laws or principles. That in virtue of this, we can be moral agents. We can kind of metaphorically legislate both for ourselves and for the universe of all rational deliberators. So in Kant's moral psychology, he recognizes that persons are composed not only of reason, which he thinks ought to be the kind of animating, driving force in moral deliberation and action, but he thinks we also have desires, and we are generally like pleasure-seeking creatures. So in terms of his kind of like general theory of like our descriptive tendencies, Kant is actually a psychological hedonist. He thinks that we generally pursue our own good and the pleasure for us. And a lot of Kant's views are kind of predicated on the idea that reason gives us a certain kind of freedom. We are free in that we can act on the basis of principles as opposed to these kind of contingent and external sort of things. And so he thinks the morally best course of action is to act through reason, a kind of recognition of duty and of the moral law. So Kant thinks that reason can motivate. This is a kind of rejection of the Humean view, which comes before it, and which is starkly in opposition to the idea that reason can play a sort of like a significant causal role in moral judgment. Hume thinks that this is really driven by desires and what he calls the passions. And Kant thinks we can recognize these kind of a priori truths, and the substantive formulations of those are a priori and synthetic. And it's in virtue of considerations about duty that we're then able to derive these. So he calls desires and appetites subjective conditions, and he notes those can lead people to act in the morally right way, but the problem there is if the circumstances were different, then they might act differently. So we can identify different types of motives. Kant thinks we can broadly classify these into the following classes. That which is self-interested. So I think that something will be in my benefit, and it's thus rational for me to act so as to bring it about. Or because of my constitution, I feel sympathy for somebody, and so I am inclined to act in a way that will benefit them. But were that sympathy manipulated in some alternative way, it could lead to me acting so as to like benefit one at the expense of others in a way that couldn't be justified to them. And what is sort of going to provide the principle and unifying reason for which one can act, Kant thinks, is that one can act on the basis that this is what I ought to do. It's because this is what could be rationally willed or accepted by creatures that are guided by reason. So Kant thinks to this question of value that we find a kind of unconditional goodness in what he calls the goodwill. He says, "It is always a matter of duty that a salesperson should not overcharge an inexperienced purchaser. Wherever there's much commerce, the prudent tradesman does not overcharge, but keeps a fixed price for everyone, so that a child buys of him as well as any other. Men are thus honestly served, but this is not enough to make us believe that the tradesperson has so acted from duty and from the principles of honesty. It's quite plausible that his own advantage required it. So Kant is saying we could take this sort of scenario and we can observe the behavior of the tradesperson. The tradesperson is engaging in a course of action which is beneficial both to the tradesperson but also to the person they are engaging in trade with. And it could be simply that they recognize that, well, it introduces a degree of risk if I choose to try to swindle somebody because it might get out and then people generally cease to trust me as much.
Customers won't come back.
Right. And so we can't sort of singularly determine whether their action is good or bad or praise or blameworthy solely on the basis of the sort of like external demonstration of it. It's about the principle that animates the action. And so Kant thinks, look, if it's the case that they're doing this because they're seeking both their own benefit and they recognize they have a means to some extent, benefit those they interact with, then that will be like a sufficiently permissible grounds. So Kant thinks that a person of good worth of moral worth is a person of goodwill, and that they freely choose to do the morally correct thing. In operating on the basis of reason, he thinks they are free. And all the more so if they fight like a countervailing desire to act in some contrary way. So this, again, is quite a bit different than the kind of Aristotelian view. Aristotle thinks the person who acts with a countervailing desire is less than fully virtuous. They haven't obtained a kind of internal harmony, and that's less of an immediate concern for Kant. So he thinks, look, you could have all of these attributes which are good with qualification, say good health or a good sense of like proportionality or a good sense of how one can be most effective. And these could be put towards ill ends. Take, for instance, any kind of authoritarian regime in history or any person involved in one such thing, like Hitler. He was sufficiently competent to achieve many of his desired ends, but any one of his attributes is only good with the sort of qualification that it can enable something good, and when it gets turned towards the destruction of humanity or the damaging of human dignity, then he thinks our moral judgment can't take this view that all things considered, there's something praiseworthy there. The thing that is sort of salient in generating the moral worth of the action is the kind of principle that animates a person. We'll be talking about his notion of the categorical imperative in the next lecture. One thing that I want to sort of distinguish now is between what he calls a hypothetical and a categorical imperative. A hypothetical imperative is of the kind that populates what we might call our kind of instrumental rationality. If you want to achieve some particular end, say winning a race, then there are certain things that follow about what you ought to do. If you want to win the race, then you ought to practice. You ought to have some sense of what time you need to meet. And so you ought to continually seek to strive to reach that. But you may not want to engage in a race, and then all of the sort of derivative obligations or things you ought to do kind of dissolve. So you might think, well, if I want to pass the exam, then I ought to attend lecture, or I ought to listen to the lecture. But if it's not the case that you want to do that, then the ought doesn't follow. Kant thinks there are what he calls categorical imperatives that apply unconditionally. So whether it's the case that say, I want to or not, I ought to respect the dignity of others. That's something that applies unconditionally on all rational creatures, he thinks. And I ought never to lie, he thinks this involves. Or the notion that in some case I ought to lie, he thinks it involves the attempted universalization of a principle which is incapable of universalization. It generates a sort of contradiction, and we'll be talking about how that is manifest. So what Kant is ruling out is that the consequences are what make a thing matter or have the particular value that it does, good or bad, right or wrong. So Kant thinks, look, even if it's the case that something you do could generate like a great benefit, say you conducted experiments on human beings that did not consent to that in order to gain some great medical knowledge, Kant thinks there's no amount of sort of consequential benefit that you could demonstrate that could outweigh the sort of harm to dignity that has been done. And there's no amount of consequential benefit that could make that action right. So another way of kind of seeing this is, again, the idea that, well, what you could be held accountable for, what could be sort of morally indicative of something associated with you, is what falls under the domain of your control. And recall that any sort of particular consequence is a result not only of you, but also like your environment and other factors that might make that particular outcome obtain or not, become more likely or not, etc. So suppose that two people go out drinking. They both become inebriated, and they then decide to return home. They both decide to drive. And one of those people gets home perfectly fine, and there's no resultant harm, no resultant particular harm. The other one is less fortunate, and along the way, they hit somebody. Now, in terms of their relative competence in these moments, we could suppose that they're roughly equivalent, that the character and manner in which they drove was comparable, and so it was merely the fact that there was a person in one location relative to the car and not in another. Had there been a similarly situated person relative to the other car, that there would be a second accident. And so there seems to be something entirely outside of either one of their control. And yet we would obviously want to significantly blame the person who had caused like injury or death. And there would be very little, or perhaps there'd be some, like somebody might say, well, like, look at what could have happened. And what Kant is trying to identify is a sort of basis by which we could say, like, well, look, they're actually equally worthy of the same sort of blame, because they each acted on a principle which had this as a sort of possibility, or they, in conducting themselves as such, failed to take into account the sort of risk, or they didn't fully respect human life. So Kant would argue that each of these actions deserves the same sort of moral response or judgment. And this gives us a way of sort of handling this problem of what we might call moral luck. If it's the case that some factor outside of your control drastically changes the situation, then one seemingly intuitive response from the standpoint of principle is to think, well, that thing outside of your control shouldn't affect whether you're praise or blameworthy. And this Kantian approach has a way then of channeling that intuition and applying it in a way that gives us the same sort of content of moral judgment across these cases. So what we will be investigating in greater depth are these notions of categorical imperatives, things that apply unconditionally to all rational creatures. And Kant thinks that these are going to be the sort that we should identify as moral. Say, you could have the obligation to practice for a game, and if you decided you didn't want to do that, or you withdrew yourself from the surrounding practice, then you could jettison or make it so that you no longer had that particular obligation. Whereas, say, to the question of whether you could discharge yourself from the obligation of respecting the humanity of another person, Kant does not think you could sort of absolve yourself of this. And he thinks this applies both to you and all others that are sort of capable of ruminating on the moral law. He thinks that...
Here's the top search result.
He thinks that it's through the sort of exercise of reason and the elimination of arbitrariness and contingency that we are capable of sort of moving beyond the particular contingent manner in which things are to the way things ought to be. Okay. We can...
Okay, cool.